Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this lovely Chicago winter evening, which I miss so dearly, to listen to me talk a little bit about this book that I just wrote. It's been a great experience. Usually I start these talks with 5 or 10 minutes about Chicago and the South Side, even when I'm on the North Side. And so it's a real pleasure not to have to do that. It's wonderful to be back around the university. Wonderful to be back in Hyde Park. I want to put this book in context a little bit, and then I'm going to read a little bit from it, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. The book is a little different venture for me. It's a personal journey, and it's written like that. And it's supposed to take you along with me as I go through the housing developments for the first time in 1989, and then up till the end of the 1990s. It's not written as an academic work. It's really written as watching me make a fool out of myself and hopefully produce some sociology along the way. So as I kind of stumble and fall, you get to ask, well, why did he do that all along the way? And the first stumble was in 1989, and if I think most of you probably know about and probably have read Freakonomics, and you'll know this one story about the way in which I got into my work with Chicago's street gangs and drug economy. And that's that I was a graduate student at the time, and I had this lovely survey with me that I constructed myself based on thorough scientific evidence. And I went into this public housing development, and I administered the survey to these residents. When I walked into the public housing development, there were mostly young men who were in the lobby, and I didn't know it at the time, but the housing development, they were pirating electricity and water. They were not supposed to be there. They asked me what I was doing there. They called me Julio. They thought I was a Mexican-American gang member from the other side of town. And they asked me to read them the survey because they just didn't believe me. And the first question on the survey was, it was trying to use sociology to understand the lives of African-American youth, young people. So what better way than to ask them directly? And the first question was, how does it feel to be black and poor? And I didn't see the problem with the question at the time because they had 5 perfectly defensible choices: really bad, bad, okay, good, and very good. Again, scientifically constructed. They chose to adopt none of those answers, and instead they gave me a profanity, and which was not on one of the answers that they could have chose. And they said, you really don't know anything. And if you want to learn about what we're like and what life is like, you need to come back and live with us. Are we getting a little bit of an echo? That was my guitar. So they asked me to. They said you really need to come back and hang out with us if you're going to try and understand what we're like. And so that's what I did. I came back the next day and I spent time with them. And I would spend the next 7 years of my life in the Robert Taylor homes, getting to know them. And what I'd like to do is just give you a sense of how I actually met JT, this very powerful street gang leader, and how he took me into his life. And because the book is really just my personal journey, and it's written in a very first-person way, and I want you to come with me as I meet JT and as I get to know this incredibly charismatic person, and just to set him up a little bit. From the first time I met him, he seemed like such an inquisitive, again, charismatic, intelligent person, just like many of the other people, but he said something that no one else in the crowd said, which is that I have a college degree. And I was floored that here's this young man who had decided to return, to come back to his community in public housing, and stake his claim for a better life in street gangs and in the drug economy, and to say no to corporate America. And we have to put ourselves back in the time, which is 1989. And it was a time when Harold Washington had just died, the first African-American mayor, who made an extraordinary contribution to the city. And there was a giant rift between whites and African-Americans in the city at the time. And so it's a little different than when it was today. I don't think at that point you could imagine a state senator and then a senator, an African-American running for president back then. I think that would have been a little difficult to do. But obviously we're at a different place today. So I met JT, and he had come back into his community to run the local gang. And I want to just read a little bit about my first exposure to him so you can see what I saw the very first few months. JT had by now firmly established his reign over a group of 3 buildings, one on State Street and one on Federal Street, each of which he'd like to walk through at least once a week. You have the CHA, the landlord, but then we also try to make sure that people are doing what they're told, he explained as we walked. We can't have this place go crazy with people misbehaving, because that's when police come around, and then customers stop coming around, and then we don't make our money. Simple as that. As we entered the lobby of one of his buildings, 2315 Federal, he grabbed a few of his foot soldiers and told them to follow us. I always start with the stairwells, JT said. And there were 3 stairwells per building, 2 on the sides and 1 running up the middle, next to the elevator. And I usually have my guys with me just in case. He winked, as if I should know what just in case meant. I didn't, but I kept quiet. We began climbing. It was only 11 on a weekday morning, but already the stairwells and landings were crowded with people drinking, smoking, and hanging out. The stairwells were poorly lit and unventilated. They smelled vile. There were puddles whose provenance I was happy not to know. The steps themselves were dangerous, many of the metal treads loose or missing. On the 5th floor, we came upon 3 older men talking and laughing, and JT looked them over. "You're all staying on the 11th floor, right?" he asked. "No," said one of them without looking up. "We moved to 1206. "Oh, to 1206, huh? And who said you could do that?" None of them answered. "You need to settle up," JT continued, "if you're in 1206, because you're supposed to stay in 1102, right?" The men just cradled their beer cans, their heads down, stung by the scolding. JT then called out to one of his foot soldiers, "Hey, Creepy, get these guys over to T-Bone." T-Bone, I knew, was one of JT's close friends and senior officers. As we resumed our climbing, I asked JT what had just happened. "Squatters," he said. "See, a lot of people who live around here don't have a lease. They just hang out in the stairs because it's too cold outside or they need a safe place. Maybe they're running from the police, or maybe they owe somebody money. We provide them protection." I found that strange. "The gang protects the squatters?" I asked. "Oh yeah, no one messes with them if they're in here. I make sure of that, but we can't have 2 million of them here, so we have to keep track. They pay us." As we continued our climb, we occasionally passed an older woman wearing a blue tenant patrol jacket. There were about a dozen of these women in each building, JT said. They make sure that the old folks are doing okay, and sometimes we help them. And somewhere around the 13th floor, JT stopped when he saw a tenant patrol woman bent over a man who was squirming on the floor. "Good morning, Ms. Easley," JT said. The man looked like he was just waking up, but I could smell vomit, and he seemed to be in some pain. He lay right outside the incinerator room, and the garbage smelled terrible. "Oh, he's coming down," Ms. Easley told JT. "He said someone told him some bad stuff." "Mm-hmm," JT said disapprovingly. "They all say that when something goes bad, always blaming it on us." "Well, can one of your boys take him to the clinic?" Ms. Easley asked. "Oh, he'll probably just be back here tonight," JT said, doing the same thing. "Yeah, baby, but we can't have him sitting here." So JT waved over the remaining foot soldier, Barry, who was trailing us. "Get a few boys and take this man down to 50th. 50th referred to the Robert Taylor Medical Clinic on 50th Street. Without my prodding, JT talked about what we had just seen. "Crackheads," he said. "Sometimes they just mix stuff, crack, heroin, alcohol, medicine, and they just can't see straight in the morning. Someone on the tenant patrol finds them and helps them." "Well, why don't you just call the ambulance?" I asked. JT looked at me skeptically. "Are you kidding me? Those folks almost never come out here when we call, or it takes them an hour." So you guys bring them to the hospital? Well, I don't like my guys doing anything for them, but once in a while I guess I feel sorry for them. Well, that's Creepy's decision, though. He's the one who runs the stairwell. The stairwells, JT explained, were the one public area in the building where the gang allowed the squatters to congregate. These areas inevitably became hangout zones for the drug addicts and the homeless, and JT's foot soldiers, who worked in shifts, were responsible for making sure that no fights broke out there. It's not a pretty job, JT told me, laughing, but that's how they learn to deal with people, learn how to be tough on them. The gang didn't charge the squatters much for staying in the building, so JT let the foot soldiers keep most of this squatter tax. This was one of the few ways foot soldiers could earn money, since they held the lowest rank in the gang's hierarchy and weren't even eligible yet to sell drugs. From JT's perspective, allowing his foot soldiers to police the stairwell served another important function. It let him see which junior members of his gang showed the potential for promotion. We kept climbing until we reached the top floor of the 16th, and I followed JT down the hallway till we came to an apartment without a front door. JT told our foot soldier escort to stand guard outside, and the young man nodded obediently. Following JT inside, I was hit by a noxious odor of vomit, urine, and burned crack. It was so dark I could barely see, and there were several mattresses spread about, some with bodies on them, and piles of dirty clothing and fast food wrappers. The holes in the wall were stuffed with rags to keep the rats out. "Sudhir, come over here," JT shouted. I followed a dim light that came from the rear of the apartment. "See this?" he said, pointing to a row of beat-up refrigerators. "This is where the squatters keep their food. Each fridge was draped with a heavy chain and padlock." "Well, where do they get their fridges?" I asked. "Well, from the housing authority," JT said, laughing. "The CHA manager sells them fridges to the squatters for a few bucks instead of taking them back to get them fixed. You see, everyone is in on it. That's one thing you're going to learn about the projects." JT explained that this apartment was a regular squat, which meant that people there paid the gang a rental fee and were therefore allowed to keep food and clothes inside. It was a squatter known as C-Note, who had been in the community for more than 2 decades, and that was the squatters' leader. It was his duty to screen other squatters who wanted to take up quarters and help them find food and shelter and make sure they obeyed all JT's rules. "We let C-Note run things inside," JT said, "but as long as he pays us and does what he says." Outside the squat, I sat down on a gallery floor, finally able to take a clear breath. I felt overwhelmed by all the new information hitting me, and I told JT I needed a rest. He smiled, seeming to understand, and he told me he'd survey the other 2 buildings by himself. When I started to resist, worried I might not have this chance again, JT read my mind. "Don't worry, Mr. Professor, I do this every week." So this was this incredibly charismatic street gang leader that I met in the early 1990s, and who quite literally started taking me on a tour of the stairwells, of the hallways, and into his world. And it was a little uneasy for me because I was so beholden to him. He told me where I could go. He told me how long I could go there. He told me who I could talk to. He told me where not to go. And very quickly, I started to feel like there's no way in which this is going to be a scientific study if I have to constantly ask this guy permission for who to talk to. There's no way in which I'm going to produce a dissertation. At least there's no way it's going to get passed if the whole thing is based on this guy's voice and it's being filtered by this gentleman. And so the struggle for me became to try and figure out how to get at different sides of this community, how to see other parts of this world that I was being introduced to, because clearly this guy was like a ward boss, and he was one of the best of them. Everyone knew him, he knew everybody else, he gave a few dollars here, they said hi to him, they did what he was told. He had full control over this building. And I was still naive enough to think that it happened without much trouble, without much difficulty, that everyone just listened to what he said because he was, I don't know, Bob Hope or something. He just had this charisma, and people just, when he sang, they danced. And then that's changed. That changed one day, and slowly I started to see another side of this life in the projects, and another side of JT. And it was, needless to say, quite eye-opening. And slowly my relationship started to change. So I'm going to read you another excerpt. It's a little smaller. And just remember that this guy, C Note, is this squatter who has basically control of the squatters in this building. He gets to say what other squatters live there. He gets to say what rooms the squatters sleep in. He taxes the squatters. He gives a little bit to the street gang and so on. So C Note is kind of like a tenant leader, except he's a squatter. Right? So he's the leader of the squatters in this place. One hot Saturday morning, I was hanging out with C Note and some other squatters in the parking lot of JT's building across the street from a basketball court. The men had set up an outdoor auto repair shop, changing tires, pounding out dents, performing minor engine repairs. The prices were low and they had lined up enough business to keep them going all day. Cars were parked at every angle in the lot. The men moved to and fro, hauling equipment, swapping tools, and chattering happily at the prospect of so much work. Another squatter had set up a nearby stand to sell soda and juice out of a cooler. I bought a drink and sat down to watch the underground economy in full bloom. Then JT drove up, accompanied by 4 of his senior officers. 3 more cars pulled up behind them, and I recognized several other gang leaders. They were JT's counterparts who ran the other local Black Kings factions in the city. JT walked over to C Note, who was peering into a car engine. JT didn't notice me. I was sitting by a white van partially hidden from view, but I could see and hear him just fine. C Note, JT yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" "What the hell does it look like I'm doing, young man?" C Note barked right back without looking up from his work. C Note wasn't usually quarrelsome, but he could be a hard-liner when it came to making his money. "We have games running today," JT said. He meant the gang's monthly basketball tournament. "You need to get this stuff out of here. Move the cars. Get all this stuff off the court." "Oh, you should have told me," C Note threw an oily cloth on the ground. "What the hell can I do? You see this work ain't finished." JT laughed. He seemed surprised that someone would challenge him. "Are you kidding me? I don't give a damn about your work. Get these cars out of here." JT looked underneath the cars. "Oh man, you got oil all over the place. You better clean that up too." C Note started waving his hands about and shouting at JT. "Oh, you're the only one who can make money around here, is that right? You own all this? You own all this land?" He started shaking his head. C Note pulled out a cigarette and lit it and kept muttering to himself. The other squatters stopped working to see what would happen next. C Note was drenched in sweat and angry as if he might lose control. JT looked down at his feet and then waved over his senior officers to him. They had been waiting by the car. A few of the other gang members also got out of their cars. Once his henchmen were near, JT spoke again to C Note. "I'm asking you one more time. You can either move this car or..." "Oh, that's crazy, boy," C Note yelled. "I ain't going anywhere. I've been here for 2 hours, and I told you I ain't finished working." C Note turned to the other squatters. "He does this every time. Every time." C Note was still chattering when JT grabbed him by the neck. In an instant, 2 of JT's officers also grabbed C Note. The 3 of them dragged C Note toward a concrete wall that separated Robert Taylor from the tracks where a commuter train ran. C Note kept shouting, but he didn't physically resist. And the other squatters turned to watch. The gang leaders nonchalantly took some sodas from their cooler without paying. "You can't do this," C Note shouted. "It's not fair." JT pushed C Note up against a concrete wall. The 2 officers, their muscular arms plastered with tattoos, pinned him in. "I told you," JT said, his face barely an inch away from C Note's, "but you just don't listen, do you?" JT sounded exasperated, but there was also a sinister tone to his voice that I never heard before. "Why are you making this harder?" he said to C Note. He started slapping C Note on the side of the head, hard, grunting with each slap, and C Note's head flopped back and forth like a little toy. "The hell with you," C Note shouted. C Note tried to look at JT in the eye, but JT was so close that C Note butted the side of JT's head with his own. This only irked JT more. JT cocked his arm and pounded C Note in the ribs. C Note held his gut, coughing violently, and then JT's henchmen pushed him to the ground. They took turns kicking him, one in the back and the other in the stomach. And when C Note curled up, they kicked him in the legs. "You should have listened to that man, fool," one of them shouted. C Note lay in a fetal position, struggling to catch his breath, and JT rolled him over and punched him in the face one last time. He then walked back toward us, head down, flexing his hand as if he had hurt it on C Note's skull. JT reached into the squatter's cooler for a soda, and that's when he finally noticed me standing there. He frowned when our eyes met, and he quickly moved away, going toward the high-rise, but his look gave me a chill. He was clearly surprised to see me, and he seemed a little peeved. I had been hanging around JT and his gang for several months by now, and I'd never seen JT engage in violence. I felt like his scribe, tailing a powerful leader who liked to joke with the tenants, and when he needed to be assertive, did so quietly. I was naive, I suppose, but I had somehow persuaded myself that just because I hadn't seen any violence, it didn't exist. Now I had seen a different side of JT's power, a far less polished presentation. So this is one of these incidents where, actually it was the first incident where this person who had been, you know, like the local alderman taking me through his little village and pointing out to, you know, the pothole that he fixed here and the permit that he got for this business owner there. All of a sudden you see how that kind of power works. And it was an extremely violent form of power. And this made me do several things. The first is it made me wonder, what the hell am I doing here? And how do I explain what I see? And what are the kinds of ethical difficulties in doing this kind of work? If you're going to study the drug economy, you're going to see drugs being sold. If you're going to study the underground economy, where the police aren't the ones who are enforcing contracts and making sure there's social order, you're going to see violence. And I was 25 at the time, maybe 26, trying to figure out, is this exactly what a sociologist should do? This is certainly not something I was going to get on my questionnaires. No one was going to answer this. No one was going to tell me this is what life was like, and I had to see it for myself. And it would continue on like this, and a couple of important things happened to me. The first is I started to get away from JT. He started to be promoted within the gang's hierarchy, which was a good thing for me because he had less time to give me the ambassadorial tour every day. He started going around the city. He started meeting other street gang leaders. He started to be worried about getting product wholesale and making business decisions that were far more consequential. I got to leave the neighborhood. I got to move around a little bit. I went to places like the Boys and Girls Club and saw what it was like for social workers to do what they do. I got to meet younger folks that couldn't be screened by JT and tried to get a sense of why they joined the gang. I started to meet some incredibly powerful tenant leaders along the way. Elected leaders like the one I talk about a lot, Ms. Bailey in this book, who had an equal sense of power. The kind of power that I saw Ms. Bailey had was, I'll tell you in one little vignette. She was an elected local advisory council president, LAC, which means she ran the affairs of the building, so that if you wanted something done, you had to make sure that she was the one who helped you, because she was the only one who could help you. There was a family in the building, the Wilsons, who didn't have a front door for a week in the middle of February. A week in the middle of February. If you remember what Robert Taylor was like, 16-story high-rises, facing the lake, the wind blowing. God only knows why they constructed them that way, but somehow they thought, they looked at France and figured that if French were doing it, it must be good. First mistake. The Wilsons didn't have a front door. How long would you wait if you didn't have a front door? What would you do? Right? It seems to me like such an obvious decision. Call the housing authority, call a janitor, call a carpenter, get yourself a front door. Okay, this is public housing. The rules are a little different. The government doesn't work for you. You can't rely on the police. You can't rely on the government. So JT's gang posted sentry outside the door. They made sure that no one robbed the Wilsons because the Wilsons were friendly to them. The Wilsons took a collection plate, went around the building, found enough money to give it to Ms. Bailey, the elected tenant leader, and she called the housing authority, paid them a little bit of money, and it only took a week for the door to get fixed, only 1 week. And so that's how I met Mrs. Bailey and found out about her authority. You know, that was a side of her that's clearly a kind of a ward boss. But she was also the first person making sure that no one ever starved in her building or went without clothes. She was the first person that tried to bring jobs to residents wherever it was possible. So you saw this side of the good and the bad sides of people. I met some incredible people who weren't in any elected position at all, but who were instrumental in helping families. There's one in the audience right now. I'm going to have her raise her hand, Miss Dorothy Beatty. I met Dorothy, Dot, who's also in the book, as the projects were coming down, as the housing developments were coming down and families needed to move. And I think we're all watching this big experiment in Chicago of how these public housing developments are coming down. One of the things that Dot was able to do was to take families and sort of move them together because she knew they were going to be together. So you'd have a network of single women. And there is no chance in a network of households that every single apartment is going to be working. So one apartment has hot water, that's the place where everyone showers. Another apartment has a working stove, that's the place that does the cooking. Someone else does the daycare and so on. So you do that for 10 years and you start to depend on each other. And so Dot would help these families move out together. Sometimes in a formal way, looking for places in the city where 5 of them could go. And sometimes they would just end up moving because one person got an apartment in Roseland and everyone else just followed. And when there's no services available, Dot's phone is the only one that's on 24 hours, 7 days a week. So extraordinary people like that who kept this community together. When JT and when the street gangs had a drive-by shooting, the police would never come. It was Dot who would take care of it by bringing the gangs together, by bringing the gang leaders together, forging a truce, even if it wasn't the most seemly kind of truce that you could imagine. But it had to be done. So this book is really about those characters and those people and the extraordinary set of circumstances. And to me, the quite beautiful place that once was public housing in Chicago, if you can imagine that. That for me, and I think for a lot of the residents, because they taught me that, it was a place it was a magical place for them because it was home. It is a magical place for many because it still exists. There are the developments are still up. There are many people in the city who rely on public housing. There are many people in the city who continue to live in housing and will live in public housing. This was not a timepiece in the sense of it doesn't exist anymore. A lot of these folks have moved out, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit about them, but public housing is still an important part of the landscape. Many of you might come across a newspaper. Eitan Michaeli's in the back. He runs a wonderful newspaper with public housing residents called the Residents' Journal that helps them stay together. I urge you to try and learn more about public housing by looking at that newspaper, and you'll meet an extraordinary set of characters in that newspaper as well. So to conclude, if you're looking for policy recommendations, there ain't any in here. If you're looking for someone who's struggling to figure out how to be a sociologist and doing more things wrong than right, that's what's in here. It was an incredible journey for me to meet JT. It was an incredible journey for me to have these people take me into their lives. And I felt that the least I could do was to try and reproduce that journey, and hopefully you'll be able to come along with me. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
To know if you are still in contact with characters like JT and others who you've discovered the neighborhood with. Do you still keep in contact, or what has happened since you finished your dissertation and such?
Mm-hmm. So the question was, do I still keep in contact with JT or any of the other people that in public housing? Dorothy and I are actually following families who've left public housing and trying to get a sense for how difficult it is for them when they move, where they're at. JT's an interesting case. Most people who run the drug economy at that level are going to go to jail or get arrested. And he's actually managing small businesses for his family. He's always was very smart, put a lot of his money away, and he's living in anonymity. And I haven't actually had the chance to give him the book, but when I do, I'm going to tell him, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. Because the whole way he thought I was his personal biographer, and he really thought I was going to be telling his story. So whether he wants it or not, his story is here. Most of the families who have left public housing have moved to the far south of the city and the far west sides of the city. And they've gone a long way from their old home. But now we're finally seeing people coming back, which is an interesting thing to watch, that they're coming back into some of these neighborhoods as they get rebuilt.
You mentioned the underground economy. Now, if you were the head of the state agency which tries to collect child support, let's say, how would you go about doing it if the fathers worked in this this cash economy or selling drugs? What kind of moral suasion could you use, or what kind of leverage could you use to do something like collect child support?
So the question is, if I was the head of the agency that was responsible for collecting child support, what kinds of strategies would I put in place to bring that about? Well, this is about as far outside my area of expertise that I can imagine. The only thing that I will say about that is that if you're going to think about child support for the families that I'm thinking about, for the families that I'm writing about and researching, the biggest myth is that there is a single family living in a single home. There usually are multiple family units with an aunt, a grandmother, many different children, many different people contributing to the home. It's so much more complicated than what agencies can handle, and I think that's part of the problem, is that most agencies just don't have the awareness of how low-income people live and how they survive. And you see men contributing greatly to the home, but in ways that aren't recorded, because they have to be careful about their income because someone is receiving money on welfare in the home and things like that. It doesn't mean they're not contributing, it just means they may not be in public view. I don't know what the good strategies are, because I'm just not too familiar with that world, but I do know one thing, which is that caseworkers often find that it's just so complex that they don't quite know where to begin.
What type of interaction did you have with the CHA, if you had any, during your research? Did you work with the administration?
For the research for this book, I had almost no formal interaction with the Chicago Housing Authority. I was mostly, if I stayed with families, I'd stay on their couch, and I was not a leaseholder. I was not paying rent in any way. And most of the interaction I saw was how the CHA maintained, or in this case, failed to maintain these buildings. And the one thing I learned was that the CHA was part of the underground economy. In most of these buildings, in Dorothy's building, there's a gentleman named Larry who was the janitor. Larry would fix stuff for $5 because the janitors for the Chicago Housing Authority wouldn't fix it. And in fact, they would pay Larry to fix whatever they needed to fix. So you had Chicago Housing Authority janitors not doing their work, getting paid, and then paying the squatters to run the place and manage the place. So it was a vibrant underground economy where everyone sort of took advantage of everyone else in a way. But I really had no formal relationship with the Housing Authority at all.
Did you, in your research, did you make any linkages between the established government historically, traditionally, and the creation of public housing in the city of Chicago? Also, did you change the names of some of the developments and individuals on purpose? For example, you mentioned 2315. Was that state or federal? It said Robert Taylor's. That's Ickes, not Robert Taylor's, right?
Yeah.
And the place that you indicated as Lichen in Paris, in France, those would be the Hilliards, wouldn't it? The tall cone-shaped. That in France, they're camouflage painted.
So a lot of questions in there. I actually did change the names of almost everyone in the book. Changed their names so that because the ethics of doing academic work, which are slightly different than the ethics involved in doing journalistic work, are that you have to limit the risk to the subjects. So when people participated in my work, even though they did it 20 years ago, they did it knowing that I would make sure that I guaranteed them anonymity. And so you have to change the numbers of buildings. I had to change the names of individuals along the way. When I was talking about France, I was simply saying that the Chicago Housing Authority looked to French theories of design, that you build up, what Le Corbusier called these machines for living, and you build up instead of building out. and that was promoted as a more enlightened way of living. It works if you're in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It works just fine. But in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, you don't have concentrated poverty. You don't have a government that's neglecting to maintain the place for 30 years and so on and so forth, which is what you have in Chicago. So it wasn't just the Hilliard homes. They actually did that for every place in the city in terms of building these high-rises.
Yeah, but I think it would be very naive to think that it was done solely for the purpose of capitalizing off of the available area, like the other question I asked you about the governmental linkages. And the fact that the daily administration, old daily administration, in cahoots with politicians, wanted to perpetuate the segregated living conditions in the city of Chicago. What did you develop or come to grips with about the creation of that whole corridor on State Street from 22nd Street all the way down to 55th Street, and the political linkages?
Yeah, this book really doesn't address that. There are other lovely works like Arnold Hirsch's work, Making the Second Ghetto, in which he talks about the explicit kind of segregation of African American and white ethnic communities by the building of the Dan Ryan, by the building of that long corridor, and the ways in which African American politicians at the time had no choice, because the white ethnic dominated city council said, hey, you either take public housing in your wards or you don't take any housing for African Americans at all. So it was a very difficult time, I think, for everyone at that particular point in the 50s and 40s and 50s.
I know you said that when you were trying to study this, when you got into the environment and became fully engaged, it was less of a strictly scientific study because you were only given one perspective, one viewpoint of how to look at it. Is this a way that you would continue to pursue your work, are continuing to pursue your work? And what are the differences between the quality of what you get out of it by becoming fully engaged in the environment as opposed to removing yourself a bit and being a little more scientific?
So there's a question about the relative utility of going deep with a couple people versus maybe stepping back and looking at a broad picture in a more scientific way. Sociology started 5 minutes from here at the corner of Woodlawn and 59th Street. It started in Chicago, and the way that sociologists first did their work was that the professors sent their faculty members out into parts of the city. And they said, go and live with the hobos. Go and live go and live in the Gold Coast. Go and study the Bohemian Quarter. Go and live in Little Italy, whatever it was, and come back. So it was people doing the very same work that I was doing. And when you read those works, sometimes people would go and they'd find 3 folks, 5 people, 6 people, and they'd write entire books about them. Some books were written about just one person. So at that time, sociology was really built around this idea of the community study, individual portraits, biographical portraits, that you respected the fact that individual researchers, like anthropologists, went out, spent time with people, found out what their life was like, and then brought it back into the university. That changed a lot in the last 75 years, so that the kind of work that I do is probably not respected at all. We're sort of the black sheep in the sociological discipline. People want to have large surveys. People want to have census data. People want to have protocols that are more conventionally scientific, all of which are extremely useful. Right? But you see in this book the kind of difficulty it is to get that kind of information about things in the world that people just don't want to tell you about. They're not going to tell you about how much money they make in the drug economy. They're not going to necessarily tell you about what they do, how do they enforce contracts, etc. So I think it requires that you change your method around and that you have to go in a little deeper. Maybe not, you don't have such a broad picture, but you try to go in as deep as you can. And sometimes along the way, you're beholden to people like a street gang leader who are responsible for allowing you to have that access. But there's a cost involved.
I had 2 questions.
Oh, go ahead.
Why do you think JT personally trusted you in order to bring you very dangerously close into the inner workings of his circle? And secondly, do you respect JT?
I think that JT found me as the person that could give him some public acknowledgement and legitimation. I think he really wanted the wider world to see him as a community man, as a person who had the same kind of capacity to help people as a politician, as a person who directed a Boys and Girls Club, as a clergy member. And I think he was really hoping that I would represent him in that way. And so he was constantly paranoid about who I was talking to and what my story was and what I was going to write about. And he always tried to make sure that I was focused on him. Did I respect him? Yeah, I think I did. Do I sort of acknowledge and approve of what he was doing? Absolutely not. And I told him that. And to this day, he's never given me a defensible reason for what he did. But you have to, you spend 7 years with somebody like that, and you start to develop somewhat of a respect for who they are as a human being, struggling for whatever they're doing. You have a question?
Yeah, my question was about, so JT was kind of your gatekeeper, limiting what you were able to see in the projects. But, I mean, generally speaking, wouldn't you say that surveys are limited by by gatekeeping effects also? So isn't it a wash in some ways?
Yeah. I think anytime you do this kind of work in communities with people, you're sort of beholden to whoever decides to talk with you at any particular point in time. So you never, especially in a neighborhood like this, where the one thing that differs from my approach in this book than most of the books you might read is that journalists maybe get a week to go into a community, if that long. I mean, if you give a journalist 3 months, they're giddy. They don't know what to do, because they never get that long for a story. And I had 7 years. So you can imagine the kinds of things that you can see. And there are very few books that people spend that kind of time. But you're always susceptible to finding the story only that finding the stories that of the people that you meet, and you're always wondering, well, what else is going on that I'm not seeing?
Do you still communicate with JT?
I do. I do still communicate with JT once in a while. He's certainly lost a lot of interest in communicating with me.
Because you said he was in anonymity. So how do you know he's in anonymity?
Oh, I just mean that he dropped out of running a gang. He dropped out of participating in that world, and he wants to be, he's taking care of his family, and he's managing a business, and he doesn't want to have the same kind of high profile that he wanted for a very long time. That's what I meant.
Once he finds out you wrote this book, do you think that he'll come after you?
I don't think
and is JT his real name, or is that just an acronym?
That's an acronym. I had to change everybody's name. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope he doesn't come after me.
He might, because he's going to be on C-SPAN, so who knows?
Yeah, might be big in that.
So I'm just curious, I'm completely ignorant of the field. I was just curious if this dichotomy that you have between the field research, which goes there and lives together with the community for months or years, and the one who just take the data and try to do some statistical analysis, is this separated, or there are someone who try to actually join the two approaches into an unified point of view, which naively I would imagine would be the more deep to use?
Yeah, there's plenty of people who've climbed hurdles and made achievements that I haven't been able to make. Let me tell you a little story about the humbling process. So when I went into this community, my head was big. I thought I had all the answers. This was probably about a year into my work. I walked in and I said, okay, there's a party. I'm going to buy some food for the kids at this party, and I bought some pizza. I thought it was pizza. I was a vegetarian at the time, so I bought pizza with cheese and tomato sauce, and I took it over, and they said, "That's not pizza." I said, "What do you mean that's not pizza? It's got bread, it's got cheese, it's got tomato sauce. That's pizza." They said, "No, there's no meat on it. That's not pizza." I said, "Well, we'll just eat it. It's pizza." They said, "That's not pizza. We're not going to eat it." So I said, "Okay, I'm the expert here." I went back to the library, to the Regenstein Library, the venerable Regenstein Library right here, very close to us. I walked in, I started reading about African American cuisine. I started reading about the history of African American food. Maybe they have a different word for pizza. I went to my advisor, the eminent William Julius Wilson, and he just started shaking his head. But I thought I was onto something. I said, maybe I should look and see, because there's a strong history of looking at cuisine in African American culture, right, in history. Often on the plantation, in slavery, the African Americans couldn't eat the same foods as others, right? So they were relegated to particular kinds of food. There's a strong social history that talks about food, etc. So I thought, okay, maybe I could go down that road. So I went back and I started asking people in the projects, okay, so if I put this on the pizza, would that be pizza? And I did this for 2 weeks, and they looked at me and they just said, could you stop it, please? We're just making fun of you the whole time. They just said, please stop. They were actually enjoying themselves for 2 weeks, and then they wouldn't do it anymore. So researchers who are these experts, right, can go into these communities and think that they know exactly what question to ask, think they know it all, and they find out that the people that they're studying are doing their best to humble them and to put them in their place. Whatever method you choose, that's a side of doing this kind of work that I don't think you hear that much about, the ways in which people fall on their feet along the way and they learn. And throughout this 7 years, these residents helped me to learn. To help me to learn not necessarily what the answers were, but what the right questions to ask. And that was an enormous contribution that people gave to me that I will never be able to pay back. Just how to ask the right questions, what to look for. And there's some of that in this book, that part of the journey as well. Should we keep going? Do we have time? Yeah.
Well, as a follow-up, what are the right questions?
I think it depends on what you're looking at. For example, people tend to study. People tend to look at the underground economy largely as something that's criminal, as opposed to something that's an economy. So if you were to look at drug sales, or if you were to look at people making food out of their home, what are the kinds of things you'd look at if you weren't looking at it as a criminal enterprise? If you're looking at it as crime, you're interested in why do people break the law, how can we stop them from breaking the law, etc. If you're looking at it as an economy, you're looking at how much do they make, what do they do with their money, why do they decide to work like this, what happens when something goes wrong, who regulates, who enforces the contracts, who are the people that help keep things together so they don't go out of control. And then you can go down different roads. So I think it sort of depends what you're looking at in some ways. Hmm?
Yes, so you
you all want to. I'm sorry. I did. I'm sorry.
You did, okay.
Me and the sound guy are on two different.
Working in impoverished areas, did you gain any insight into kinds of programs, either government or non-governmental, that might help alleviate poverty, or you just kind of get disillusioned with the entire idea and think it'll be permanent, or what?
The question was about programs and what kind of insights did I learn about that. That's a difficult question. The one thing that I think that programs, and with respect to public housing anyway, that they do wrong is they don't involve residents in the programs, in the design of the programs. So, for example, I just talked about the work that Dorothy has been doing for years. Okay, contrast that with what the Housing Authority does. When the Housing Authority wants to move a family, they move the Wilson family. And they say that, okay, if someone's living in your house illegally, they're not going to be able to move with you. So it's the mother and their 2 children. But all those people in the household might be playing a very important role. Now, Dorothy says we can't move the Wilsons. We have to move the Wilsons, we have to move the grandmother, we have to move the people that rely on the Wilsons next door, and we have to move a whole set of people, a whole set of families together. It's just a different approach because it respects how the families are living their lives in a way that government policy never can. And never usually does. It's a bottom-up approach. And that's one of the, I mean, I'm not a policy expert, but that's one of the small ways in which I think just awareness of how people actually live can go a long way when you construct these kinds of policies for them. I'm sorry, ma'am.
Yes, I do. I was asking, you from India, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, was those at
your country be as interested in this book as we are here, being that they have the same issues of problems? Will your book sell pretty much there too? Will you put it in their language, in a print?
So the question is about whether this book will sell in India.
Yeah.
I won't have to change the language, but because the country is pretty much an English-speaking country. But I will. I have no idea whether they'll they'll buy this book. There are now roughly 300 million people in the middle class in India. So I hope even a tenth of them, just a tenth, go out and buy this book. I'll be happy. That's all. I'm not asking for a lot. Just a tenth. Yeah. Go ahead.
This is a two-part question. I wanted to know what's the goal and aim for your book, first off.
Okay.
What's the goal and aim for your book?
Okay, you want me to answer, or do you want to
because one point I want to make is the things that you're pointing out in your book isn't new for many African Americans, you know, living in that community and even sometimes, you know, nationwide. And what I wanted to find out is, do you have any solutions? You know, are any type of solutions, can you point out any type of, you know, just actions that can be taken to prevent, you know, poor African Americans for being crowded into public housing?
I think that's a great question. Question is about solutions and the ways in which books like these can or do not help to promote kinds of solutions. This particular book is really written as my story, and it's not got a lot of it's not got a lot of policies and solutions and programs. It does talk a little bit about some of the extraordinary work that people do. People like police officers who come from the community, clergy, people like Dorothy, and the kinds of work that they do. And the reason I think that is actually a step towards solutions is that not a lot of people actually know what goes on. And one of the first steps, I think, in actually getting towards a more appropriate solutions is just awareness of the social conditions that people live in. I mean, I am struck every day by just the lack of exposure that people have to each other. And Chicago is a segregated city, continues to be a segregated city. So I'm hoping that people who might not otherwise go into low-income communities might pick up the book and maybe ask themselves, okay, why am I not going in, or what more can I do?
And also, do you feel that you being from the University of Chicago and you having a graduate degree and being from a different ethnicity actually helps get exposure out? Because that's one key thing about your book, because there are many books of that nature from African Americans that actually lived in the projects, that have been brought up and actually have become doctors and lawyers. So do you think you being from a different ethnicity and actually going to the University of Chicago help get the awareness up?
Yeah, I can't. It would be a mistake for me to not say that that's an advantage, right? I mean, there's a wonderful book written by an African-American journalist called Brothers about growing up in the Robert Taylor homes. Beautiful book, which was very important at that particular time. And there are a lot of books written by African-Americans about life in Robert Taylor, life around in those other communities. But that's the world we live in, right? That's the world we live in, and it's the crazy world we live in, where someone who doesn't come from the community, someone who has a college degree from the University of Chicago, actually has a better shot at getting this word out. I totally agree. I can't explain how that works, but I totally agree that that's...
I do respect you taking that effort to do that, because not a lot of people taking effort, especially from different races and ethnicities, to understand our problems and what we have to go through.
Thank you.
So.
Okay.
I just wanted to know too, as being Black African American, just as you made the point and how you did have that hands-on experience with them, did you put in the end of the book a greater story? Because all it is the secrets that were revealed. But like you said, today and where we stand as black people, just as you talked about the presidency, God has brought us a mighty long way. So we don't even want to go there, but it just shows you where you can start here and end up here. This is what it's doing in the world and the economy today. So I want to know, in your book, did you give us that kind of for the ending of it, even with these people that you changed the names for? Because as a black person, we've gone through a lot racially. It is a spiritual thing, and it does take a healing in the land, and this is what we're going through in the process that's bringing us all together even tonight, the racism, the different nationalities, because we are all one. So I just want to know, as to buy that book, I would want to hear something positive, or to know that where it started from, where these people are today, as opposed to just leaving it there. It's like the same question that the young man was asking. We need to know that where we're going, or what was done, about it. Socially, did anything get changed, or what is the whole purpose of it? To say that you went there for an on-hands experience, which is beautiful, mean that you were even chosen to do that, because you wouldn't even survive if you wasn't chosen to do that. You don't survive in these things. There are blacks that didn't survive going through that process. So I just want to know the positive in the end of your book. How does it actually end?
Yeah.
The end of your story.
Well, I'm going to throw a little different spin on what's positive about that.
Okay.
Because there's some things that I can't do just because I'm not an expert in it, and I'd be talking about stuff that I don't know, and I don't want to do that, which is what's happening today. For that, you need experts like Dorothy, you need experts like people on the ground who are following these families. The one thing that I wanted to do with this book was to talk about people who made this place a home and who made this place a community. Because too often, these kinds of communities get looked at as chaos. They get looked at as people who are not obeying the law, people who are not working, people who don't have any value, and there's nothing we can learn from them. And I wanted to try and write this and take you into the lives of some of these characters by saying, hey, you know what? I can appreciate that woman's struggle, that single mother's struggle. Hey, you know what? I can appreciate that minister, why he's doing what he's doing in his own way, because he has no help. And if it's, again, for me, it's about awareness, and it's about getting people to change their stereotypes and to change their views. And that's really what I wanted to try and do with this book. It's not going to really do much more, I think, along the lines of what you're saying, because that's not really where my expertise is. But if I can just change your perceptions a little bit about the people that are in these places, so that when you drive, not you necessarily, but maybe others who drive by low-income communities, others who drive by public housing, they won't immediately jump to the same old stereotypes about what they think is going on in those places. That, to me, would be an enormous contribution if I could do that. I think we're running out of one more question. Ms. Beatty?
I'm Dorothy David, and I am real in the book. As far as changes, we follow 400 families from Robert Taylor, and within those 400 families, I could probably say that we have over 300 that have made definite positive changes. And each day we're continuing to make changes. So I think in the book, you will find that a lot of people made changes because of the research that he was doing, and they'll continue making changes because of the transformation and how it failed us, and yet some people say it helped us. So out of 400 families, over 300, I think that's a proud change.
Well, I'm going to let Dorothy have the last word. Thank you. And thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this lovely Chicago winter evening, which I miss so dearly, to listen to me talk a little bit about this book that I just wrote. It's been a great experience. Usually I start these talks with 5 or 10 minutes about Chicago and the South Side, even when I'm on the North Side. And so it's a real pleasure not to have to do that. It's wonderful to be back around the university. Wonderful to be back in Hyde Park. I want to put this book in context a little bit, and then I'm going to read a little bit from it, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. The book is a little different venture for me. It's a personal journey, and it's written like that. And it's supposed to take you along with me as I go through the housing developments for the first time in 1989, and then up till the sort of the end of the 1990s. It's not written as an academic work. It's really written as watching me make a fool out of myself and hopefully produce some sociology along the way. So as I kind of stumble and fall, you get to ask, well, why did he do that all along the way? And the first stumble was in 1989, and if I think most of you probably know about and probably have read Freakonomics, and you'll know this one story about the way in which I got into my work with Chicago's street gangs and drug economy. And that's that I was a graduate student at the time, and I had this lovely survey with me that I constructed myself based on thorough scientific evidence. And I went into this public housing development, and I administered the survey to these residents. When I walked into the public housing development, there were mostly young men who were in the lobby, and I didn't know it at the time, but the housing development, they were pirating electricity and water. They were not supposed to be there. They asked me what I was doing there. They called me Julio. They thought I was a Mexican-American gang member from the other side of town. And they asked me to read them the survey because they just didn't believe me. And the first question on the survey was, it was trying to use sociology to understand the lives of African-American youth, young people. So what better way than to ask them directly? And the first question was, how does it feel to be black and poor? And I didn't see the problem with the question at the time because they had 5 perfectly defensible choices: really bad, bad, okay, good, and very good. Again, scientifically constructed. They chose to adopt none of those answers, and instead they gave me a profanity, and which was not on one of the answers that they could have chose. And they said, you really don't know anything. And if you want to learn about what we're like and what life is like, you need to come back and live with us. Are we getting a little bit of an echo? That was my guitar. So they asked me to. They said you really need to come back and hang out with us if you're going to try and understand what we're like. And so that's what I did. I came back the next day and I spent time with them. And I would spend the next 7 years of my life in the Robert Taylor homes, getting to know them. And what I'd like to do is just, as we continued our climb, we occasionally passed an older woman wearing a blue tenant patrol jacket. There were about a dozen of these women in each building, JT said. They make sure that the old folks are doing okay, and sometimes we help them. And somewhere around the 13th floor, JT stopped when he saw a tenant patrol woman bent over a man who was squirming on the floor. "Good morning, Ms. Easley," JT said. The man looked like he was just waking up, but I could smell vomit, and he seemed to be in some pain. He lay right outside the incinerator room, and the garbage smelled terrible. "Oh, he's coming down," Ms. Easley told JT. "He said someone sold him some bad stuff." "Mm-hmm," JT said disapprovingly. "They all say that when something goes bad, always blaming it on us." "Well, can one of your boys take him to the clinic?" Ms. Easley asked. "Oh, he'll probably just be back here tonight," JT said, doing the same thing. "Yeah, baby, but we can't have him sitting here." So JT waved over the remaining foot soldier, Barry, who was trailing us. "Get a few boys and take this man down to 50th. 50th referred to the Robert Taylor Medical Clinic on 50th Street. Without my prodding, JT talked about what we had just seen. Crackheads, he said. Sometimes they just mix stuff, crack, heroin, alcohol, medicine, and they just can't see straight in the morning. Someone on the tenant patrol finds them and helps them. "Well, why don't you just call the ambulance?" I asked. JT looked at me skeptically. "Are you kidding me? Those folks almost never come out here when we call, or it takes them an hour." "So you guys bring them to the hospital?" "Well, I don't like my guys doing anything for them, but once in a while I guess I feel sorry for them. Well, that's Creepy's decision, though. He's the one who runs the stairwell. The stairwells, JT explained, were the one public area in the building where the gang allowed the squatters to congregate. These areas inevitably became hangout zones for the drug addicts and the homeless, and JT's foot soldiers, who worked in shifts, were responsible for making sure that no fights broke out there. It's not a pretty job, JT told me, laughing, but that's how they learn to deal with people, learn how to be tough on them. Give you a sense of how I actually met JT, this very powerful street gang leader, and how he took me into his life. And because the book is really my personal journey, and it's written in a very first-person way, and I want you to come with me as I meet JT and as I get to know this incredibly charismatic person, and just to set him up a little bit. For the first time I met him, he seemed like such an inquisitive, again, charismatic, intelligent person, just like many of the other people, but he said something that no one else in the crowd said, which is that I have a college degree. And I was floored that here's this young man who had decided to return, to come back to his community in public housing and stake his claim for a better life in street gangs and in the drug economy, and to say no to corporate America. And we have to put ourselves back in the time, which is 1989. And it was a time when Harold Washington had just died, the first African-American mayor, who made an extraordinary contribution to the city. And there was a giant rift between whites and African-Americans in the city at the time. And so it's a little different than when it was today. I don't think at that point you could imagine a state senator and then a senator, an African-American, running for president back then. I think that would have been a little difficult to do. But obviously we're at a different place today. So I met JT, and he had come back into his community to run the local gang. And I want to just read a little bit about my first exposure to him so you can see what I saw the very first few months. JT had by now firmly established his reign over a group of 3 buildings, one on State Street and one on Federal Street, each of which he'd like to walk through at least once a week. You have the CHA, the landlord, but then we also try to make sure that people are doing what they're told, he explained as we walked. We can't have this place go crazy with people misbehaving, because that's when police come around, and then customers stop coming around, and then we don't make our money. Simple as that. As we entered the lobby of one of his buildings, 2315 Federal, he grabbed a few of his foot soldiers and told them to follow us. I always start with the stairwells, JT said. And there were 3 stairwells per building, 2 on the sides and 1 running up the middle, next to the elevator. And I usually have my guys with me just in case. He winked, as if I should know what just in case meant. I didn't, but I kept quiet. We began climbing. It was only 11 on a weekday morning, but already the stairwells and landings were crowded with people drinking, smoking, and hanging out. The stairwells were poorly lit and unventilated. They smelled vile. There were puddles whose provenance I was happy not to know. The steps themselves were dangerous, many of the metal treads loose or missing. On the 5th floor, we came upon 3 older men talking and laughing, and JT looked them over. "You're all staying on the 11th floor, right?" he asked. "No," said one of them without looking up. "We moved to 1206. "Oh, to 1206, huh? And who said you could do that?" None of them answered. "You need to settle up," JT continued, "if you're in 1206, because you're supposed to stay in 1102, right?" The men just cradled their beer cans, their heads down, stung by the scolding. JT then called out to one of his foot soldiers, "Hey, Creepy, get these guys over to T-Bone." T-Bone, I knew, was one of JT's close friends and senior officers. As we resumed our climbing, I asked JT what had just happened. "Squatters," he said. "See, a lot of people who live around here don't have a lease. They just hang out in the stairs because it's too cold outside or they need a safe place. Maybe they're running from the police, or maybe they owe somebody money. We provide them protection." I found that strange. "The gang protects the squatters?" I asked. "Oh yeah, no one messes with them if they're in here. I make sure of that, but we can't have 2 million of them here, so we have to keep track. They pay us."